Chapter 14. First Date. Bonnie's Grill was an old diner in the centre of town, with a broken flashing sign out the front advertising home cooking. The place was mostly a stopover for truckers and a haunt for late-night workers, not the sort of place you take a classy woman on a date if there was any other choice. But it was the only place open at this time, so Dalton decided it would have to do. He sat across from the dock, in one of the booths beside the shutter-lined windows. He smoked a cigarette as she drank her coffee, both of them already relaxed in each other's company. "Are you always better than they are?" the doc asked him after a while. Dalton took a second to consider the answer, but felt he knew it already. "Pretty much," he told her honestly. "Never been put down," she followed up. Dalton had, of course. Everyone loses a fight at some point, especially when you're young and learning the ropes. But he knew that she meant since he started this line of work professionally, since he became the Dalton. "No," he told her, without any bravado. A moment later he added, "Not really," remembering a couple of times he'd needed Wade Garrett's help to get up off the floor from under a rain of boots aimed at his head. But then, he'd still been the one standing at the end, so it didn't count as being put down to his mind. "How do you explain that?" the doc asked. He thought for a second, then said, "The ones who go looking for trouble are not as much of a problem as someone who's ready for them." It was true, and in his head it sounded philosophical, but now he'd said it out loud, he wondered if she might not think it was something he'd read in a fortune cookie. "I suspect it's always been that way," he added. He looked in her eyes to see what she thought of the answer he'd given, but saw that she was glancing sideways towards the nearby serving counter. He looked over at the sound of a creaking stool, just in time to reach out a hand and stop an old, dozing patron from falling off his perch. Dalton and the doc chuckled gently at the scene, but then she looked more serious again. "Somebody has to do it," she went on, clearly trying to get some sort of answer from him. "Somebody's got to pay somebody to do it," he corrected, knowing where he fell in that equation. "Might as well be you," she said, a sad look on her face. Dalton didn't know what to make of that, didn't know what she wanted from him. He stubbed out his cigarette. "I better take you home," he suggested, pocketing his pack of smokes. "If I keep talking, you're going to go off thinking I'm a nice guy." He stood up out of the booth to offer her his hand. The doc stayed sat, staring up at him with a serious look. "I know you're not a nice guy," she said bluntly, but there was the hint of a smile on her face and in her eyes. A grumbling voice drew Dalton's attention away. "Pretty soon I'm going to have to start charging that bum rent," the cook said from behind the counter, indicating the old man on the stool. He was now fully asleep, and Dalton had to reach out again to sit him up and stop him from falling. Dalton reached into his pants and pulled out his wallet, drawing out a $20 bill and throwing it down next to the man. "Tonight's rent," he said. The cook picked it up and seemed to agree with the deal, as Dalton and the doc headed out. After they left the diner, Elizabeth drove Dalton back to the Double Deuce parking lot in her open-top Jeep Wrangler. His was the only car there, everyone else having gone home already. As they neared the car, she saw that someone had trashed it. The windows were broken out, and at least 2 of the tires were slashed. There was even a long metal road sign that had been speared through a side window and was now laying across the rear seats. "Your fan club?" she asked, as they pulled up alongside. "They are devoted," Dalton chuckled, and somehow she wasn't surprised to see that he wasn't shocked or angry. She turned off the Jeep's engine, and they sat there for a moment in the early morning darkness, no sound but the keys jingling in the ignition. You live some kind of life, Dalton, she told him after a while. He seemed to consider that. Too ugly for you? He said, a statement that sounded like a question. She had been considering the answer to that question on the whole drive over here, before that even. I didn't say that, she answered quickly. They sat there a moment longer, looking at each other. Elizabeth wondered if that was the answer he had hoped for. She hoped it was. He unclicked his seatbelt and leaned over towards her. She met him with her lips halfway, hand running along his chest. For a man who could be so rough, his kiss was gentle. She liked it. Afterwards he leaned back into his chair, not asking any more and not expecting it. She liked that too. See ya, he said quietly. Bye, she returned, her body still tingling. Elizabeth watched as Dalton got out of the Jeep and headed to his battered car. She turned on her engine and started to back out of the lot. As she did, she watched him pulling the metal pole with "Stop" written on top back out through the window, and wondered what she was doing here with a man like this. She drove off, leaving him standing there with the sign propped up next to him, and hoped that the sign wasn't a sign.